This is VOA Africa.
Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Friday, March 26th. Welcome to Africa 54. We continue to work remotely because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but what hasn't changed is our commitment to bringing you the latest and most important news from the African continent and around the world. This is today's Africa 54. Eritrea has agreed to withdraw troops from Ethiopian territory along their common border, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said on Friday. The Ethiopian National Defence Force will now take over guarding the border area effective immediately. Meanwhile, Abiy rejected U.S. calls for a unilateral ceasefire in the northern Tigray region and dismissed allegations of ethnic cleansing, according to a senior U.S. lawmaker sent to Addis Ababa by President Joe Biden. However, Democratic Senator Chris Coons, recounting his talks with Abiy last weekend in the Ethiopian capital, praised the Prime Minister for publicly acknowledging for the first time that troops from neighboring Eritrea entered Tigray during the 5-month-old conflict after months of denials. Abiy also pledged this week following Coons' visit that any soldiers who carry out human rights violations will be punished. Coons said he pressed Abiy during both days of their meetings on March 20th and 21st to declare a ceasefire, but Abiy declined, arguing that the fighting had largely stopped and the situation by then amounted to a law enforcement action where they're pursuing a few TPLF senior leaders. The United Nations said on Thursday more than 500 rape cases have been reported in 5 clinics in Tigray, including men being forced to rape their own family members under the threat of violence, and that the actual numbers were likely to be far higher. In southern Africa, helicopter gunships exchanged fire with suspected Islamist insurgents as fighting raged for a second day around a gas hub town in northern Mozambique, according to a security source and a diplomat. The government said security forces were working to restore order in Palma, which is adjacent to gas projects worth $60 billion, led by companies including Total, after it came under a 3-pronged attack on Wednesday. The attack in a province that has since 2017 been targeted by Islamist insurgents with links to Islamic State began hours after the French oil major said it would resume work on the project after halting it for security reasons. The security source told Reuters on Thursday that orgies were visible in the streets, some of them beheaded. Reuters could not independently confirm that detail. The government said it had no information about casualties or damage as communications to the town had been cut. A huge container ship blocking the Suez Canal like a beached whale may take weeks to free, according to the salvage company. Meanwhile, officials stopped all ships entering the channel on Thursday in a new setback for global trade. The 400-meter Ever Given is blocking transit in both directions through one of the world's busiest shipping channels for oil and refined fuels, grain and other trade, linking Asia and Europe. Late on Thursday, dredgers were still working to remove thousands of tons of sand from around the ship's bow. The Suez Canal Authority said earlier that 9 tugboats were working to move the vessel, which got stuck diagonally across the single-lane southern stretch of the canal on Tuesday morning amid high winds and a dust storm. A total of 206 large container ships, tankers carrying oil and gas and bulk vessels hauling grain have backed up at either end of the canal, creating one of the worst shipping jams seen for years. Deaf children in Egypt face serious obstacles when seeking an education because many come from poor families and far-off rural areas. The government provides only secondary education for deaf students, though some churches offer a primary school for these disabled children. Edward Yeranian reports for VOA from Cairo.
16-year-old Esther is one of the lucky few among deaf children in Egypt able to receive a good education despite financial and social obstacles. She completed 6 years at the Episcopal Church's deaf unit in Cairo and now attends a government high school.
School at the deaf unit taught me many things. The government school is not as good.
At the deaf primary school, students learn the basics, gaining knowledge they will need to communicate with other people, overcome prejudice in society, and contribute productively.
The children learn reading and writing from an academic perspective, and then they learn a skill so they can earn a living and not depend on society.
Many of Egypt's 5 million deaf people come from poor and rural areas and have uneducated parents who are unable to speak to their deaf children.
We teach the parents how to use the sign language, and that's good, enable the parents to communicate with their children.
Father Clement teaches the children ethics and good conduct. He is deaf himself and says he remembers his childhood in Sudan, where the deaf were often ignored and marginalized by society. His first-hand knowledge from experience helps him teach with compassion and empathy.
Deaf people have a hard time. They often don't want to be taught. They learn from their friends in the cafes, and they learn bad habits, which causes problems.
Teaching at the deaf school requires patience. It also requires sign language. Recruiting teachers with these skills is not always easy. Another stumbling block, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic forced the school to close the boarding section.
We used to provide accommodation for these children who come from far away and who cannot afford the transportation every day. But now, because of the pandemic, we were not able to bring them close to each other because this increased the risk of being infected with the virus.
Despite these challenges, the school remains open to help prepare these young students for the world. Graduates like Esther leave with options and choices.
I like to visit my old teachers and to help young deaf students. When I finish high school, I want to go to college and study home economics.
Most importantly, Esther's education has opened new horizons. Edward Uranian for VOA News, Cairo.
Cameroonian music lover Paul Chana opened a tiny record shop in the early 80s and built a college of more than 5,000 original vinyl records. When compact discs arrived, his little record store struggled, but eventually became a kind of museum, with customers going there to learn about music history. Anne Zwako has this report narrated by Moki Edwin Kinzeka in Yaoundé.
Paul Chana started selling vinyl records in Cameroon in the early 80s in a tiny shop, only 6 meters square. When compact disc CDs arrived, he found himself with a growing stock of unsold records. But instead of switching to CDs, he bought even more records from other shops that went out of business and began selling to foreign collectors.
J'ai mes clients de vinyle, que ce soit au Cameroun, que ce soit
95% of my customers are outside the country in Europe. They often order vinyl from me from Europe. They have brothers and friends who come to Cameroon.
Although Chana's tiny shop didn't grow, his collection did, to more than 5,000 records stored mainly at home. But the shop became a kind of vinyl museum.
It makes me very, very happy to see that the record store have kept vinyl records for a long time. Because the kids today, the ones who were born recently, don't know them yet. If we don't tell them there was stuff like this before, they can't know.
Chana says young people often mistake his shop for a bookstore.
What do they call a book? It's this vinyl that they mistake for a book because they've never seen one. And I say to them, my son, that's not a book, that's a vinyl record. They're surprised every time because they have never seen one.
Cameroon's National Museum, under the Ministry of Arts and Culture, applauds collections like Chana's.
We invite him to get in touch with the Ministry of Arts and Culture, where there are specialised services that can help him to digitise and open it up so the younger generation can benefit from it.
While vinyl is not as popular as it once was, it still holds a special place in the hearts of Cameroon's former record sellers and music fans. Collectors like Chana remember with fondness the music technology from a simpler time. For Anne Zwanke in Yaoundé, Moki, Edwin Kinzeka for VOA News.
In the global race against emerging variant of COVID-19, experts say it is imperative to reach herd immunity quickly by vaccinating as many people as possible. VOA correspondent Maria Madiello reports on the range of vaccines being used in the U.S. and elsewhere.
In the United States, 3 vaccines are being used: Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, and a recent addition from Johnson & Johnson. U.S. health experts say all have been rigorously vetted. There are some differences in delivery and some debate about their efficacy rates.
It gets very confusing because the J&J, which comes in at 66%, people go, well, that's 66%, whereas Pfizer and Moderna are each 95%. Well, shouldn't I go with Moderna or Pfizer? Then the answer is, well, look, the J&J field trials were done in a different point in time when there were variants. So when you're looking at your top line goal is block severe disease and death, those 3 perform exceptionally well. So grab one.
The British-Swedish AstraZeneca vaccine developed with Oxford University researchers has been used worldwide. But recently, some European countries temporarily suspended use of the vaccine over fears of a link to blood clots. After a review last week by the World Health Organization's Vaccine Safety Panel, the vaccine was once again given the go-ahead.
We urge countries to continue using this important vaccine. The AstraZeneca vaccine is especially important because it accounts for more than 90% of the vaccines being distributed through COVAX.
COVAX is a WHO-led initiative to help ensure equitable distribution of the vaccines, especially to low-income countries. In general, there are several types of vaccines. Some are developed from older technologies, such as so-called inactivated or live-weakened vaccines, while others, such as the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, rely on newer methods, such as the messenger RNA. Public health expert William J. Moss explains.
The messenger RNA and the adenovirus vector vaccines work a little differently. Instead of injecting the protein or the whole virus, basically we're injecting the genetic recipe so that our own cells make the spike protein, and then we develop an immune response to that.
There are a number of other vaccines that have been developed around the world, including Russia's Sputnik V and a number of others by China. While they do have an important role, it's crucial they go through the full data collection processes, says Moss.
One of the challenges, I'd say, with those, both the Sputnik and some of the Chinese vaccines, is that they were rolled out in some populations before we really had all the phase 3, trial.
But a number of countries are using the Russian and Chinese vaccines, with health officials in some nations taking the first jab themselves to reassure their populations. Recently, Sputnik V did provide additional data, as has one of the Chinese vaccine companies. So far, their track records have been positive. Given the challenges of a global pandemic, having a broad portfolio of vaccines is a good thing, say health experts.
One of the biggest obstacles that we faced is the manufacturing capacity. We need 14 to 15 billion doses of vaccines in order to get to herd immunity within this entire world. That's a staggering number.
Mariama Diallo, VOA News, Washington.
U.S. officials say Russian state media is citing false reports to undermine faith in Western COVID vaccines in an effort to promote Russia's own Sputnik V vaccine. Daria DeGoods has the story.
4 Russian state media outlets are broadcasting false information about the vaccines being produced in Western countries, according to the U.S. State Department's Global Engagement Center. The outlets are pushing claims that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are ineffective, produce serious side effects, and even that the manufacturing companies took dangerous shortcuts during the certification process. The State Department has denounced these claims.
It is very clear that Russia is up to its old tricks, and in doing so is potentially putting people at risk by spreading disinformation about vaccines that we know to be saving lives every day.
The White House is also aware about the disinformation campaign.
We will reiterate that at every opportunity, these vaccines are safe. They've been approved by the FDA.
One of the Russian sites, Newsfront, has reported, for example, that the coronavirus was manufactured in the U.S. However, Vladimir Putin's press secretary has called the accusations coming from the U.S. nonsense. But research by the media watchdog group, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, shows 48 out of 50 vaccine-related tweets by Russian state media focused on the alleged negative effects of the Pfizer vaccine. Brett Schaffer of the German Marshall Fund says it's all part of a plan to push the Russian Sputnik V vaccine.
These countries have their own vaccines that they're trying to distribute to the world. So it was much more targeted that there was a lot of geopolitical considerations, there were economic considerations, there were a lot of different factors that went into play.
Just as with Russian disinformation during U.S. presidential elections, it's hard to gauge the actual impact of this current disinformation campaign against the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. What is clear is that it is creating confusion.
For those people who want to be anti-liberal, it's just giving them more fodder and giving them another reason to get upset. It's also, I think, fostered greater concern about, well, which vaccine should I get? There's 3 of them out there. And so I think it's adding to the confusion over that. And we are seeing people being afraid to get the vaccine if it's of the wrong kind.
The Russian Sputnik V has not yet been approved for use in the EU, but has been approved in at least 50 countries around the world. Daria Digus for VOA News, Washington.
As always, we would like to hear what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Still to come, man's quest to return to the moon and the fascination with Mars. Stay with us. Welcome back to Africa 54. In his first formal news conference Thursday, President Joe Biden faced tough questioning about the surge of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border and announced that the United States will not meet its May 1st deadline to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara has the story.
Immigration was a major focus in President Joe Biden's news conference, the first one since he came into office. Biden rejected the perception that he is seen as soft on the issue, prompting the surge of Central American migrants crossing into the U.S. from Mexico.
That's why they're coming, because Biden's a good guy. Truth of the matter is, nothing has changed. As many people came, 28% increase in children to the border in my administration, 31% in the last year in 2019 before the pandemic in the Trump administration.
Earlier this week, Biden appointed Vice President Kamala Harris to lead efforts to address root causes of the migrant surge. On the foreign policy front, the president announced the United States is unlikely to meet its May 1st deadline to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. He did not offer a firm timeline.
How and in what circumstances do we meet that agreement that was made by President Trump to leave under a deal that looks like it's not being able to be worked out to begin with. How's that done? But we are not staying a long time.
With the Afghan conflict escalating in recent years, the announcement was not a surprise to some observers.
But the fact was that when the Biden administration took place, we had made essentially zero progress, both in ending the fighting, which had grown more intense, in defining a single aspect of the peace process.
The U.S. leader also addressed North Korea's recent launch of 2 short-range ballistic missiles off its east coast, calling it a violation of a United Nations resolution.
There will be responses if they choose to escalate. We will respond accordingly. But I'm also prepared for some form of diplomacy.
President Biden also said he will work with allies to insist that his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping follows international rules.
What I've told him in person on several occasions, that we're not looking for confrontation, although we know there will be steep competition.
I thought his discussion of China focused on something that really will be a shift, moving away from simply confrontation in trade and a military buildup to some kind of relationship which could possibly bound the competition.
The president also announced he would double his vaccine goals to 200 million doses in his first 100 days, and that he expects to seek a second term in 2024 with Vice President Kamala Harris again as his running mate.
But folks, I'm going.
He spent just over an hour fielding tough questions. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
NASA's Wright brothers' moment on Mars comes complete with a piece of Earth history on board, plus the space agency eyes its return to the moon, and a record-setting explorer sets another. VOA's Arash Arbasadi brings us the week in space.
NASA this week previewed the Martian launch of its Ingenuity helicopter. It rides aboard the agency's Mars rover Perseverance. NASA Planetary Science Division Director Lori Glaze says the future of Mars research may depend on Ingenuity.
Ingenuity will open new possibilities and will spark questions for the future about what we could accomplish with an aerial explorer. Could we image areas not visible from space or that a rover couldn't reach, like shadowed craters with seasonal water flow?
Glaze adds the aerial mission could shape how drones support future missions with humans. Also having made the trip from Earth to Mars is a small piece of fabric from the plane the Wright brothers used in their historic first flight in 1903. Now, less than 120 years later from that historic flight, NASA will attempt launching a craft on another planet. Ingenuity's first flight is not expected before April 8th. On Earth, meanwhile, NASA completed an 8-minute hot fire test in Mississippi. The test of NASA's Space Launch System simulates a trip from the ground to orbit. The agency cut short a similar test in January, but with this week's success, NASA moves closer to another manned flight to the moon as part of the Artemis program. Finally this week, an exploration of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth. Richard Garriott just finished a trip there.
It is almost 11,000 meters of seawater deep. That is deeper than Mount Everest is high above sea level by a couple thousand meters at least.
This is Richard Garriott. I'm here with Victor Vescovo. We are in the submarine limiting factor.
Garriott and research partner Victor Vescovo collected water samples to study, among other things, microplastic contamination. Garriott is the only person to have been to the Mariana Trench, the North and South Poles, and the International Space Station. Bon voyage. Arash Arbasadi, VOA News.
And for a nice and easy transition to the weekend ahead, here's a top trending song from the Seychelles, Babadoo by on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, have a great weekend.